Alright, all you glorious gamers out there, welcome to the PlayersToo Podcast, the video game podcast for gamers like you, by gamers like you. You can find PlayersToo on all the social media, that's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, the lot. You can also find our written content over at PlayersToo.com, that's PlayerStoo.com. And if you could take 5 seconds to give us 5 stars over on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, it really, really helps us out. It does a huge amount for the exposure of the show. And while you're over there, if you could leave us a little review as well, again, it just helps us out even more. And thank you so much to anyone that's already done that for us. It genuinely does mean a lot. You are an absolute legend to us. Alright, and on with the show. My name is Mark Henderson. With me, as always, Mr. Lewis Camley. How's it going, Lewis?
It's going not bad at all, Mark. How you doing?
Not bad. Still lockdown. Lockdown's potentially getting worse again. Even worse, I should say. Yeah, pretty miserable. But I mean, so's the rest of the world, so I can take some solace in that.
As long as everyone else is suffering, eh?
Yeah, exactly. Schadenfreude, right?
Exactly.
That's sort of that.
It's the Scottish way. I nipped out for a walk just before we started recording.
Lucky for some.
I know. Well, I like to get a wee bit of air before we do this, usually partly because I have to sit in this goddamn cupboard the whole time. And what I saw, Mark, was what I think was the first poster for the PS5 that I've seen out in the wild. I saw a huge bus side advertisement for the PS5, which I guess in a normal console launch cycle we would be outdoors more and out in the world more and seeing adverts on stuff more. Yeah, you'd see them more, I guess. Yeah, that's true. I think if I wasn't as involved in this kind of thing these days, like if I was just a normal person paying attention to games, it would feel quite hard to know that there was anything much going on. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of external buzz really around the new console launches. Do you feel that? Maybe that's just that I'm locked in my little echo chamber just now.
Well, it's very possibly that. It's difficult to gauge if there is general buzz around because we can't get around anymore. We can't possibly gauge that. I mean, I'm sure that people that are interested in gaming are definitely aware that there will be new consoles this generation. In terms of gauging excitement, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot happening in the world right now, Lewis, isn't there? So maybe those feelings are slightly tampered from where they otherwise might have been. But anyway, Lewis, video games. What have you been playing?
Yeah, video games, Mark. Well, I'm just continuing my playthroughs of both Hollow Knight and Desperados 3 at the moment, so not a ton to report, really. Hollow Knight, I have progressed a little bit. I've now reached the part where the guide that I'm loosely following has gone off in a direction that I can't exactly follow. I have to go and do some stuff first before I can rejoin what the guide is suggesting to do, because I need to get some power-ups and I need to grind for some geo to buy some upgrades and that kind of stuff. So I think I'm basically about halfway through the game now. Still feels like I've got miles to go. It doesn't really feel like much is going to change now other than the abilities, which I think I've still got quite a few to get. So yeah, that is what it is. Everything that I've said about it still stands. I kind of needed a little break from it this weekend. I just needed something that wasn't as taxing and demanding, which is what Desperados 3 became. So I had probably my longest session with that game so far, which I've only been playing quite sparingly, but I sat for maybe 3 or 4 hours on Sunday, maybe longer than that actually, and just put some time into it and began to really see what directions that game is going to push in. So I've unlocked a few more characters. The missions at the beginning are still very tutorial-y. It's still introducing the mechanics and it's showing you how different characters bring different things to the table, but it's also fleshing out the story quite quickly, which I don't know if you remember when I spoke about this, what must have been 2 or 3 weeks ago when I first played it. I was kind of quite dismissive of the story because it felt like it's the third game in a series. I'm not even sure where it sits in relationship to the stories of the other games, but quite quickly it's brought in some characters and it's brought in some tensions that I'm actually like, I don't need this really, it's not what I'm here for the game for, but there's enough there to keep that side of it interesting as well, because I do wonder if this type of game without a hook like that, once you get good at it and once you're so used to the mechanics and the systems at play, it might become a bit academic and not actually all that fun, or you won't feel the reason to keep going with it,
Yeah, absolutely, man, absolutely.
What about yourself, Mark? What have you been playing this week?
Well, Lewis, I have actually been playing nothing this week at all. I've been taking one of my gaming breaks after having spent so much time with Bloodborne. I've decided to take a little break, and I've found that this is quite good for me. It re-energises me for getting in, playing a new game, as opposed to it feeling like a wee bit of a slog starting a new game. I don't know if anyone else feels that, but I don't know if it's a certain anxiety about starting a new game, but sometimes I feel as though I'm being pressured into starting a new game rather than me feeling naturally ready for it, if that makes sense. Yep. So I'm finding that taking a break between big games, specifically big games that have taken a lot of time investment, but also like quite heavy emotional investment, I would say. So I think that is definitely a welcome break. However, Lewis, you brought up something that I actually wanted to talk about last week, and that is using a guide. I used a guide on Bloodborne, and I used a guide on Hollow Knight when I played through Hollow Knight. And you have also said just now as well, and I'm sure you said last week and maybe a couple of times before, you are using a guide on your playthrough of Hollow Knight. Mm-hmm. What I'd just like to say about that is that there's no shame in using a guide. And in actual fact, I would go so far as to say that I am so incredibly glad that I did use a guide in Bloodborne and in Hollow Knight.
Yeah.
Because let's face it, gaming time is precious, isn't it? If you're like me and Lewis, you like to play a lot of games. And some games are just so demanding of time that you struggle to have room to play the games that you want to play if you're always constantly investing in the one game over and over again. And also, I find that is conducive to falling away from games as well. If you've maybe spent too much time with it and it becomes a little bit boring with you, if that makes any sense at all. As well, with these games, I would use a guide pretty loosely. I usually use a guide to tell me where to go. I mean, there's guides down to, particularly for Bloodborne, I noticed there's guides down to every single enemy and how you should traverse every single area. And tactics to use. It is really, really super, super in-depth. And the people that put these guides together are incredible. Mm-hmm. I have to say, like, incredible work goes into this for nothing, basically. I mean, they're just doing it out of the goodness of their hearts because they're incredibly passionate about the game. But the details of some of the guides that I saw were unbelievable. But the one that I was using, I was basically just using to know where to go to the next area, basically, or what is a good logical next step for me at any given point in the game, you know, because games like Bloodborne and Hollow Knight are pretty open. I mean, you can go to a lot of different areas at any one time and you can progress different paths at any one time. It's just sort of good to know what is a good idea to do at given times considering your skill levels, you know. That's sort of how I use guides. But I mean, even if you were using a guide to find out the location of every single enemy, I think that if it comes down to, particularly with games like this that are particularly difficult, and the difficulty does put a lot of people off, and the time investment that it would take for a lot of people to, quotes, get good, isn't really worth it for them. Mm-hmm. I think that really using a guide could alleviate a lot of that and alleviate a lot of that stress. And I always think that if it's going to come down to the fact that you play the game using a guide, and I'm sure a purist would say you're not getting the full experience or whatever, or not playing the game at all, then I would definitely always come down on the side of, no, play the game. Always choose to play the game. And if you're saying, well, you're not getting the full experience, well, I saw a lot more of Bloodborne using a guide than I would have done not using a guide, just because of all the little intricate areas in the map that I might not have explored or might not have even found otherwise. I'm incredibly grateful for using the guide, and it's something that I've seen come up a few times, particularly in the Soulsborne community, which is a very hardcore community, of course. But I mean, for most people, like, you're not trying to impress anyone here. You know what I mean? If you want to play the game, and if using a guide makes you play that game or makes you feel more comfortable playing that game, then fucking go for it, man. You know?
I totally agree with everything that you're saying there, Mark. I mean, particularly for this type of game, your Hollow Knight, your Soulsborns. I even used one for Jedi Fallen Order, actually, when I was playing that, which again was just all about not wanting to miss anything that was either, one, added a lot to the experience of that game, or two, things that would help me be better at it. So in the example of Hollow Knight, there's loads of things that I would never have found or might never have bothered trying to get to, you know, that have provided me with currency or with, you know, with charm upgrades to make me a better player within the game, which if I didn't follow the guide I wouldn't have got them. As you said, I would have 100% have fallen off the game by now. So absolutely, if that is what is stopping you from getting through a game or just experiencing one of these brilliant games, just use a guide. Use it sparingly. Use it to get you through tough bits. Use it to find secrets if you want to. I tend not to look at what the descriptions of how to fight bosses when I'm looking at these guides until I've been beaten several times, and then I think, okay, well, now I just want to get past this, so give me some tips. But, you know, from the light touch to the absolutely following it to the letter, it's completely up to you as a player what kind of experience you want to have.
Yeah, and particularly knowing the stuff that I almost certainly would have missed in Bloodborne hadn't I used the guide. I'm super glad that I used the guide.
Yeah.
Like, really, I genuinely am. I would never have found a lot of what I would consider really important stuff in the game hadn't I used the guide. So I'm really thankful for it in that game specifically, and I imagine that probably carries through pretty strongly on the rest of the Soulsborne series, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, no shame in using the guide, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely no shame whatsoever. Particularly if it makes you play the game. Like, if you find that you're spending too much time in the game, not having fun or not progressing, or you're just quite frankly stuck, or you don't know where to go, or whatever, if you can consult a guide just to get you over that hump and continue playing the game, I always choose to continue playing the game. That is what we're all about here, you know what I mean? We're here to play games, we're here to talk about them. So, always choose to play the game. Always choose to play the game. Play the fucking game. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, and in that very weird ending, time for the news. Alright, and news item number 1. Halo Infinite director Chris Lee has stepped down. Halo Infinite has been delayed indefinitely, as we all know, although 343 has promised that it will be out next year. This follows the loss of creative director Tim Longo and executive producer Mary Olsen in August 2019. So this is actually the second director that Halo Infinite has lost in as many years. At the time Tim Longo and Mary Olsen left, 343 said that, quotes, "The overall creative vision and production of the game remains led by Chris Lee. However, shortly after that, Microsoft brought in 2 Halo/Microsoft veterans to take over the single player and the multiplayer development of the game, and now we see that he has stepped down." So, this does not necessarily mean that there is trouble in the development of Halo Infinite. But Lewis, if there were trouble with the Halo Infinite development, this is the kind of thing that would be happening.
It is indeed, yeah. I mean, it's hard not to look at this and think that it's a continuation, at least, of the problems that we saw at the moment that Halo Infinite was delayed in the first place. You don't go dropping creative directors, especially within a year of the game's likely release now, post-delay. You know, I mean, the game's supposed to be out in a week's time, really. So,
well, it was supposed to have been out in a week's time, yes.
Yeah, it suggests there's trouble at the mill, basically. I mean, there's just no way that... And the fact that Xbox haven't really said anything about why this is, there's no scandal like there was at Ubisoft when the Assassin's Creed Valhalla director had to step down. None of that has come out, which suggests that it's simply that they are not massively happy with how the game looks. Is that your read on the situation?
That is exactly my read on this situation. Chris Lee continues to be a Microsoft employee, to be clear. He's not been sacked in any capacity, but he does seem to have been replaced in his job with 343 on the development of Halo Infinite. You could argue, I suppose, that this is good for the project, perhaps. Judging by what Microsoft has chosen to show of the game and the reaction to that, the game doesn't look great, I think it's fair to say, at this point. And clearly Microsoft felt the need to make a change, but at this stage in the development, without a widespread overhaul that would mean a huge delay, I can't imagine that the project that will be released sometime in Q1 next year, which is when I predict anyway that Halo Infinite will come out, that project that is released would have been too different to what Chris Lee would have released if he were still there.
Yeah, it's surely not possible to pivot enough away from what they had, you know, like you say, without scrapping the game as it was, basically. So it can only be about drafting these 2 veterans in to tidy it up and to, you know, like you say, it might not necessarily be a bad thing for the project, because we also don't know, you know, what was the relationship like between him and his team, say, and maybe that is what the decision is, that it's going to be better to be led by someone else. But yeah, it's got all the hallmarks of that thing in football where, you know, you lose badly to a team and then you sack the manager, and sometimes that works and sometimes it really doesn't work, and it just feels like that moment to me. We just don't know, you know.
Yeah, I would agree. And also, this is just continually not great for Xbox, who, as you said, in a week are going to be launching a console with Master Chief's face all over the boxes, and the game seems to still be in some sort of turmoil. It feels like, anyway, you know. I mean, sacking directors at any point during the production of a game is generally not a good sign. But now we've seen 2 go from this project and an executive leave the project as well in the last 2 years on the run up to when the game was supposed to be released. That to me very much is not a great sign.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, and news item number 2. Todd Howard, director of Bethesda's Fallout and Elder Scrolls series, has said in an interview with GamesIndustry.biz that he finds it, quotes, hard to imagine that the Elder Scrolls 6 would be an exclusive to the Xbox, considering the ubiquity of Skyrim. This is a relatively small piece from a larger interview with Todd Howard over at GamesIndustry.biz, which was actually really good, so links in the show notes over at PlayersToo.com. It's definitely worth a read. In that interview, he does also talk in glowing terms about Games Pass, and one of the key quotes from the article is Howard saying that the next generation is about access. The article is also keen to point out that Bethesda VP Pete Hines has said that Bethesda will continue to publish its own games. So, with all that information combined, Lewis, around the exclusivity of Bethesda games potentially being locked behind the Xbox in the future, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I'm feeling slightly more vindicated in my continued belief that the days are not numbered for Bethesda on PlayStation going forward. It goes back to what we were talking about last week with Phil Spencer's comments around the very same thing. There's a continued inability from either Bethesda or Xbox to directly say that they won't be on other platforms. And we've had plenty of good discussions about why that might be or what PR reasons there might be for that. But to have the head of the studio say a thing like that in an interview, I don't know why you would be putting out so many statements like that you then have to walk back from all of them when you inevitably don't put it on the PlayStation, as was kind of being posited before. So it's an open window, at least for PlayStation fans. And, we're quote-unquote Sony ponies. I don't really care about Bethesda games. I don't play Bethesda games all that much. So this isn't me going, come on, PlayStation, we're still the main thing. I just think genuinely for them there's a strong business case for doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I also spoke about how I don't feel quite so strongly about this on previous conversations, and there is absolutely nothing concrete in what Todd Howard has said here, but I have to admit that after hearing his comments, I am even a bit more optimistic about the future that you are positing. I wonder if this inability to commit to saying that these games will be Xbox exclusives in the future has to do with the fact that the deal hasn't technically gone through yet. That was something else that also came up in the article, and that Phil Spencer had said in his interview last week as well, although we didn't bring it up in the podcast. But the deal actually hasn't gone through and won't be finalised until next year. And I wonder if neither of them are willing to commit to saying these games will be Xbox exclusives until that deal has gone through. So that was another thought of mine, I suppose. Yeah, and there could be something in that in as far as it would have an impact on like the stock price of both companies, or certainly of Xbox. That was a whole thing around the Cyberpunk delay last week as well. That's why the devs weren't told about it on time, or in advance of the media, was because it would basically be seen as insider trading to give out information like that. So it could be something business technical like that we're not even really thinking of as gamers. I don't buy for a second, as Phil Spencer has tried to suggest before, that they haven't really had that conversation yet. I just don't accept that at all. No. To be clear as well, I am still very much in the camp of Bethesda games will eventually, at some point in the future, maybe a couple of years from now, be entirely exclusive on the Xbox and PC. I still genuinely believe that. I think that fucking sucks a lot for PlayStation gamers, of which I am obviously one. I play way more Bethesda games than Lewis does, so this would suck massively for me. But I do have a little bit more hope now, having heard Todd Howard's comments. And to be even more clear, I would fucking love to be proven wrong. I hope that this comment ages horribly, and in 5 years' time we are still getting loads of Bethesda games published on the PlayStation 5. I would love to be wrong about this, but as of right now, I'm sort of in the camp that eventually, X amount of years in the future, obviously after Deathloop and Tokyo Ghostwire, which will be timed PlayStation exclusives, there will come a time where Bethesda games will only be published on the Xbox. And although Pete Hines says that they are still in control, if your Microsoft overlords say, well, you can't publish those games anywhere apart from on our systems, then I don't really think that Bethesda have any recourse for that.
I can't really get my head around that whole piece, really. How is it that Bethesda are still publishing their own games independently of Xbox Game Studios?
I'm not massively sure either, to be honest with you, but in reality I think that it's a distinction without a difference. Bethesda will be publishing it through their own publishing house, through their own people, but the games will be getting funded by Microsoft ultimately, you know. They'll ultimately be Microsoft funded games. They'll just be published through Bethesda's publishing house rather than through Microsoft's publishing house, you know. I don't really think that will make a lot of difference when Xbox and Bethesda are both owned by Microsoft, so it doesn't really matter, I don't think.
I mean, that is basically my understanding of it as well, but it's not the first time that they've made it clear. I mean, in the initial announcement of the deal, it was said that Bethesda would still be publishing games. In my head, it feels more likely that what they'll be doing is things like, was it Fallout Shelter or something that was called, the mobile game?
Yeah.
I could see them publishing that, or like the Elder Blades mobile game through their own imprint rather than giving it the full Xbox sort of studios name.
Yeah, perhaps it could easily be something like that. Yeah. I mean, it'd be pretty sad to see Bethesda's publishing devolve to the point of only mobile games, to be honest. But yeah, unfortunately, that could be the future we are heading towards. But the point I'm trying to make, I suppose, is that although Bethesda are still publishing their own games and in control of publishing their own games, I'm not sure that they will necessarily be in control of where they publish their own games. All right, news item number 3. In its latest earnings report, Ubisoft has announced the delay of Far Cry 6 and Rainbow Six Quarantine. The reasoning for this was to leverage their full potential in the context of production challenges caused by COVID-19. Now, that's a very weird way of saying that it's COVID's fault, or that's what they're blaming it on anyway. Far Cry 6 was due out on the 18th of February, and Rainbow Six Quarantine was given a 2020 release window. However, it seems that both of these games will now be pushed to Ubisoft's next financial year, so that will be April 2021 to March 2022, but obviously we are all hoping, I suppose, that it is far closer to April than it is to March 2022. The Far Cry team also made this follow-up statement on Twitter.
Earlier this year, we introduced you to Far Cry 6, the most ambitious game in the series to date. We promised an immersive fantasy to lead a modern-day guerrilla revolution set in a rich and exotic world filled with memorable moments, killer characters, and an epic story. While we know you're all anxious to get your hands on Far Cry 6, we want to let you know that we've been given more time to allow us to make this the game you aspire to play, while focusing on the well-being of our teams in this unprecedented global context. Our teams around the world are working in the studios and from their homes to pour their passion and creativity into making an unforgettable game, one we hope you will love. We hope you're all safe and healthy and get ready to experience Yara and Far Cry 6 soon.
So, Lewis, I suppose, what do we make of these delays? I think that when Far Cry 6 was announced and the date was then attached to it immediately, we both said on this podcast, we'll believe that date when they hit it. So, in a lot of ways, I'm not surprised at all that Far Cry 6 has been delayed. I'm perhaps surprised that it's been delayed so soon after it was announced they would have a February release date. However, Rainbow Six Quarantine, we've now known about that for a long time, and I believe that it was actually due to come out at the beginning of this year. It was then delayed along with basically every other Ubisoft game when they were having a bit of a shake-up, it seemed, and a bit of a rethink about the rollout of games. But it was always supposed to release in 2020, and now we're finding out that it's not even going to release in Q1 of 2021. So is this spelling problems, perhaps?
I think there's probably quite a lot going on with Rainbow Six Quarantine. I think they've said it's COVID, and I'm completely willing to have that as an excuse, even if it's not.
Oh, of course. I didn't mean to be flippant by saying that it was an excuse. Yeah. I do believe that is a completely valid excuse and has almost certainly been extremely challenging for all game devs to have to
I'm surprised
deal with that.
More studios haven't been leaning on that because it's such an easy and acceptable reason for games to be being delayed just now. I think it also has to be borne in mind that, Ubisoft were originally kind of re-looking at how they do games, how they develop and publish their games after a couple of flops at the start of 2020. Then COVID happened. Obviously, there's been this suggestion that Rainbow Six Quarantine might have to change its name anyway as a result of that. Then there's the whole Ubisoft sort of sex and workplace culture issue, which I think we'll come on to in a wee bit. But that in itself must be creating internal problems. And I think quite simply with Rainbow Six as well, they're probably more interested right now as a company in making sure that the next gen versions of Rainbow Six Siege are what they should be, because that game is still massively well supported by its fan base. So I could imagine that quarantine has just been pushed into the long grass for a while because they don't really feel there's a need for it. It's a possibly slightly insensitive game while people are literally still having to quarantine in real life, which I know it seems like a silly point, but marketing has its value. You don't want to
from a PR and marketing point of view, it's not from political correctness and massive quotes point of view. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's how do you put out a TV advert that is talking about people being quarantined right now? It's just it's a bad
exactly.
look, so.
Yeah, it's not good. To use a very corporate word, it's not good optics.
Exactly,
I would say.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I suppose that the other part of this, which Lewis has already touched on, is that in the same earnings report, Ubisoft have given an update on their, quotes, culture transformation following multiple allegations of sexual misconduct at the company. And despite firing some high-level offenders, which is obviously a very good thing, they have just been horrible at communicating on this subject in every capacity. However, they have now canvassed 14,000 employees, and based on their feedback have, one, introduced compulsory anti-sexism and anti-harassment training, which has apparently been taken by 75% of their teams, have recruited a new Vice President of Global Diversity and Inclusion, and established a, quotes, content review committee to, quotes, ensure that the group's content and product marketing is aligned with Ubisoft's values of respect and fairness. On this subject, Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot has said this.
While much remains to be done, our team's testimonies showed a deep attachment to Ubisoft and a strong desire to defend the values of respect and benevolence on which the group was built. We are committed to making the necessary changes to create an exemplary workplace culture of which everyone at Ubisoft can be proud.
So, although it is definitely good that they are taking steps in what is obviously the right direction, I would hold off on too much praise at this moment, I would say, and we will wait to see how these things work out, and if the culture there does improve. It will certainly not be for the CEO of Ubisoft to tell us whether or not these things are working. It will definitely be for the employees to tell us whether or not these things are working. So hopefully we hear reports of improvements soon. Alright, and news item number 4. Nintendo has had one of their Direct Minis this week, and if we've learned anything about the Direct Minis, it is that there is not a massive amount to talk about. However, the major headlines are that Bravely Default 2 has got a release date of February the 26th, Immortals Phoenix Rising is coming to the Switch at launch on December the 3rd, No More Heroes 1 and 2 shadow dropped on the Switch, with No More Heroes 3 coming in 2021, and Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity has a demo that also shadow dropped at the time the Direct went live. But Lewis, what I actually want to talk about is the fact that the Control Ultimate Edition and Hitman 3 will also be coming to Switch. Control actually shadow dropped as well at the time of the announcement. And you might be thinking, how can these games possibly run on a Switch? Because Control, as we discussed at the time when we were both playing Control, barely ran on a PlayStation 4. But the reason for this is because these are cloud versions of the games. And this is sort of Nintendo's answer to a streaming service, I suppose, without actually announcing that they have streaming or a service in any capacity. But what this does mean is that you won't be able to play the games without a strong and stable internet connection, which means playing the games undocked is a bit tenuous, and certainly if you want to go outside, it's basically not possible. However, what came as an even bigger surprise to me, Lewis, was that this isn't even the first, quotes, cloud game that Nintendo has. Both Phantasy Star Online 2 and Resident Evil 7 got cloud releases, and I didn't even know about it. I suppose my question is, why aren't Nintendo shouting about the fact that they now have cloud gaming on their system? And is this how Nintendo stay relevant in the coming generation? Because I was very concerned that in the coming generational leap, the Nintendo Switch would be very much left behind and wouldn't really be able to provide massive AAA game experiences on the Switch that were available on the next gen consoles. I mean, they struggle to do that with the current gen consoles, you know?
Yeah, there's a lot in this, Mark. It's an interesting bit of news for Nintendo generally. So to pick up on your first point, why isn't Nintendo shouting about it? I mean, it's a weird thing that they're not shouting about it. It is odd that those other games, Resident Evil and Phantasy Star, the fact that they had cloud editions, I think that may have just been in Japan, but I could be wrong about that. I just kind of heard that on the grapevine. But it's weird that they haven't made a big song and dance about the fact that that has worked and therefore that they could do it with other games, because then it would lead to so much conjecture about what kinds of games might come to Switch. Honestly, I think that they're not shouting about it because it is a straight up admission that the system itself is not good enough to play games like that, basically, is the only reason I could see.
Yeah, I never really thought about that, but that's a very fair point, yeah.
Like you said, I mean, there's categorically no way that Control could run on the Switch in anything like its original form. I mean, obviously they boiled down The Witcher 3 enough that it would run natively on the Switch, but Control is pushing towards the end of what this generation of proper big consoles can do. So, you know, there's just no way the Switch could do that. So I think that is probably why they're not making a big song and dance about it. However, Mark, you say, is this their way to stay relevant? And I think it absolutely is their way of staying relevant, because I think not only does the lack of ability to play big future AAA games come into play there, there'll be smaller games, there'll be indie games, there'll be AA games which are pushing towards what the Switch is capable of, but also that if there's no price difference and we're still not really able to move around too much, it starts to beg the question of, like, why would you pick the Switch version, a 720p version, when it's the same on your PS5 or your Xbox Series X, the same price, the same game, but just in much higher quality.
That's a good point, yeah.
So I think that, I don't think they'll do it a lot necessarily. I think you're seeing it there. Control and Hitman are kind of AA to AAA games, that there's a lot of buzz around, that they have a fan base, that I could see that it's worth doing this for, and I think that is probably what they'll do going forward. You might start to see, for example, Bethesda games or Ubisoft games being delivered on the Switch in this way in the future, but I don't think it will be the norm necessarily. What's your take on it all? It's such a strange thing, like, to be talking about streaming on Nintendo all of a sudden.
Yeah, I know. That's sort of why I brought this up, because it also doesn't seem as if a lot of people in the gaming spheres are talking about this at all. But in actual fact, I find this really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And I also think that it is a good way for Nintendo to stay relevant and to deliver AAA games on the Switch, which has hardware that is frankly incapable of playing them. But that is a very good point that you raised there. If the game on Switch costs the same, or more than likely costs more than it does on other systems, maybe not when we get into the next generation, but almost certainly still more expensive than playing it on PC, why would you choose to play it on a Switch at a lower resolution than you could on better hardware, you know? Although I never really thought that the Switch was the place to play big AAA games in the first place, you know? I'm just thinking, who is that serving very well now?
Like, who's making use of a streamed game that possibly wasn't before?
Yeah.
I think that it's there for, you know, people like ourselves, loads of people that have the Switch as a second console. Something like Hitman that's coming to PS5, but that you might not be able to buy a PS5 yet, or you might just be waiting a bit longer or whatever, but that's something that you could pick up on Switch and play in that way. It's a potential. I guess it's there also for people who the Switch is their primary console for whatever reason. You and I probably discount them all too often, because it does seem like most people have the Switch as a secondary system, but obviously there'll be loads of people out there who are only playing or predominantly playing on Switch and want their shot at Control or other games like that. But yeah, the question will still be there, I think, even with a streaming option. Why would you pick the streaming option if you have any of the other consoles? You know, that's the case that Nintendo still has to make a little bit, you know. If there's no subscription around it, if it's a game-by-game basis, I'm not really sure how they get over that. Yeah,
very interesting, Liz. I would love to hear more about this from Nintendo, who have said literally nothing so far as I'm aware. It would be very, very interesting to see how this plays out. It's definitely something I'll be keeping my eye on in future. Definitely as we head into the next gen.
And just one final thing on that, because we often put pelters into Nintendo for their bad customer service or their bad services generally. The way that Control seems to be working is that you get to play a sort of a short demo. I think it's basically the opening of the game up until the first main part of the action for free to test your connection and how well the game runs, and then you're prompted to pay for it. And I just like that, and I think that should be mentioned.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I was unaware of that,
Yeah.
but that's really nice. And in actual fact, I would love to see other streaming services take that on.
Yeah.
That's really nice. So you're basically getting a demo to make sure that the game
It
actually
can
works.
work, yeah.
Well, in the world of very unstable internet connections for a lot of the world, I think that is a very, very good thing. All right, and finishing off as we always do with a couple of shout outs. Shout out number 1, first podcast of the month, and that means free games, Lewis. Free games. On your PlayStation Plus subscription, you will get Middle-earth Shadow of War, Hollow Knight Voidheart Edition, which Lewis could have got for free if he'd only started the game a few weeks later. And Lewis, the first PlayStation 5 game included on your PS Plus subscription, and it's Bugsnax, the fever dream that is Bugsnax. So there you go. If you buy a PlayStation 5 or you get yourself a PlayStation 5 this month, you will all be able to play Bugsnax for free. And on Xbox Games with Gold, you will get Aragami Shadow Edition, Swim Sanity with an exclamation mark, Full Spectrum Warrior, and Lego Indiana Jones. Xbox, you have to find an alternative to this. You either have to try harder at the Games with Gold, or you need to find another way.
Classics.
Or else this section is going to become the PlayStation Plus section in the coming months. Alright, and shout out number 2. Dirt 5 has come out this week, Lewis. Currently sitting at an 82 on the PS4, an 83 on Xbox, and a 77 on PC. The game seems to be pretty fucking fun. Like, real fun. A nice arcade racer. It's definitely not trying to be a racing sim, and in a lot of ways, I sort of prefer that for my racing games these days. There are not a massive amount of racing games out there these days as well, it does have to be said. And I've not been a massive fan of the Dirt series in general, but if you're looking for a cool, fun racing game, this could be the one for you.
I think you're totally right that racing games, there's big tentpole series still going, obviously, but
yeah, your Forza, your Gran Turismos.
Yeah, but even then, it's kind of like one release every. It feels like we've not had a Gran Turismo for years. Just some fresh energy in that space would be quite good. I don't love racing games, I never did, but I liked having the option every now and again. It's a good, fun, particularly co-op thing to do. So
yeah, absolutely, absolutely, man. Alright, and shout out number 3, and the bigger game that came out this week, Lewis, was Watch Dogs Legion, and the reviews are okay-ish. Currently sitting with a Metacritic score of 76 on PC, 77 on Xbox, and 72 on PS4. You might be thinking those are pretty underwhelming, and to be honest, they are. The positives from the game seem to be the recruit anyone and the play as anyone system is pretty good. A lot of people seem to be responding positively to that. The new hacking mechanics do seem to be an improvement on previous games, although maybe the diversity in hacking mechanics isn't as great as you might like it to be. It does seem that some reviewers have experienced technical issues with the game as well, which never helps. Also, because you can recruit and play as anyone, it seems to be hard to get properly invested in the story. I've seen several people say this, because you don't have a true, proper protagonist there, And despite everything that they showed off about that world, the dystopian future of London, all the mad tech and whatever, a lot of people seem to be reporting that the world is boring, which I think is something only achievable from Ubisoft, to make a world that cool boring. And as well, you get the usual Ubisoft stuff of the missions can feel repetitive. But basically, the game at its core is fine. A smash hit, it is not, Lewis. But I'm not going to lie, I'm probably still going to check it out.
Yeah, it's still so fascinating as a project that even with its flaws, it feels like it's worth seeing just to understand what that system is and what it's capable of. And, it's a bit like when the Nemesis system was in Shadow of Mordor before. It feels like a game worth playing just because that's quite a new concept and a new idea, even if the rest of it isn't actually all that great, which is a shame, basically, because it did have a lot of promise there.
It really did have a lot of promise, and it seems to be the same things that are sort of letting Ubisoft down again and again.
Yeah.
It's sort of this cookie cutter open world game, you know what I mean? All Ubisoft games have a very similar feel to them, I think, or certainly their open world games do, and I know that was something that they were keen to address from that financial report that we had way back when they were delayed all their games and were talking about shaking things up. Obviously this game was in development long before that, so we're perhaps still not seeing the implications of that on their new game design, but unfortunately this one feels as though it has come from the Ubisoft open world machine, which is unfortunate because, as you said, the game did have a hell of a lot of promise. All right, Lewis, and with that, time for a beer, and then we'll be back with Topic of the Week. And we are back for Topic of the Week. Topic of the Week this week is our play-along of Tacoma. Tacoma is the second game by Fullbright Games after Gone Home, which was our previous play-along game. This game, like Gone Home, is also a walking simulator. The game takes place in 2088 in a hyper-capitalist, hyper-corporate, hyper-consumerist world. You play as Amy Ferrier, who has been employed by a mega corporation called Venturis to recover data from an abandoned space station called Tacoma. As you explore the space station, you quickly discover that it has been hit by an asteroid, meaning that the crew that were on board were left with very little oxygen, and the game is really discovering how the crew members dealt with that situation. As I said, the game is very much a walking simulator, like Gone Home, but this time you're shown small vignettes, basically, of what the crew were doing as recorded by the AI in the space station. The AI being called Odin, who's actually quite an important character. And these vignettes are played out in-game as augmented reality and plays out little scenes basically for you, and you can travel around the level and follow characters about to hear bits of dialogue between certain characters, and this is all works basically by being able to fast forward and rewind the vignettes in real time, and that basically is the only real mechanic in the game apart from being able to pick up and drop objects, would you say?
Yeah, more or less, yeah. I mean, other than that vignette system which you described well there, it works in exactly the same way as Gone Home does. You are able to move around, pick stuff up, look out for little kind of additional bits of detail and stuff on them. But yeah, in this game, the vast majority really plays out within those essentially kind of like 3D videos that you can maneuver about in and rewind and fast forward so that you get all the information that is contained within them. And it, you know, it very satisfyingly ticks off at the bottom on the little timeline when you've got all the information from each individual character's kind of computer console as well. So you're, I think, in a way more so than in Gone Home, which we will, I'm sure, constantly be comparing this game to because they're very similar, obviously. Your sense of progression and of what you have learned in each section as being all that there is to learn, I think is a lot clearer in this game than it was in Gone Home, which you could easily finish that game and have missed things and not even be aware of it, whereas I don't really think that was the case here.
No, probably not, and maybe we'll come on to that very shortly. But Lewis, how did you feel about the game, by and large?
Overall, I mean, I enjoyed it, definitely did. I think it's got quite an interesting, slightly kind of twisty story as it goes through. I didn't love the new mechanic that was introduced, to be totally honest, and probably we'll dive into that a bit deeper. I think overall, I found it enjoyable, but I thought that Gone Home was a lot better in a lot of different ways. Like a lot better is too strong. I thought Gone Home was a more elegant tale, a more elegant telling of that tale, and also I think that, and this might just be personal preference, but for me, Gone Home was so based in reality and our lived experience that it was very easy to connect, and in that game you played as someone who had a direct connection to the people whose lives you were effectively uncovering in the game, you know, as you explore this house.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas here, there's just layers of separation for me as the player. You're playing as someone who is not directly connected really to anyone that is in the game.
None of the characters in the space station.
Yeah.
You are there to investigate what happened to them, ostensibly, and your character does not have any relationship whatsoever to anyone on the ship.
Exactly that, yeah. And even finding out what happened to them isn't technically your prime goal, although it is obviously the prime goal of the gameplay, so that's maybe a bit of a moot point. But so there's that. Then there's the added layer of it being set in the distant future, in space, which just removes it again from anything that we would understand or have a direct connection to, which, you know, most games are that. Obviously, I'm not saying a game should be a realistic story necessarily, but just this type of tale where it wants you to get invested in the what happened to these people and why did it happen happen and how did they all react. I felt held at distance from it more, and that is so dialed up by the way that the gameplay works, by this kind of watching what happened, being able to control it as this almost like godlike figure can control the action, and seeing the other characters just as these kind of wireframe sprites reminded me a lot actually of Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which played out with these ghostly light figures. It's maybe just a limitation of the game and of the studio and of the size of project that it is, but having them not be represented as actual people whose emotions you can read and all of that, just, I don't know, it could have really built up it does have some quite touching emotional stuff going on in the game and some really nice relationships, but I just felt way more distant to it all than I did for Gone Home.
Well, Lewis, I would like to echo almost everything that you said
nice.
there. I was actually quite concerned that I was going to come into this with quite a negative view of Tacoma, and you were going to come into it with a very positive view of Tacoma, and then this would devolve quite quickly into a major argument. However, that is not what is going to be the case, it appears. I would agree with you in almost every single facet that you said there. I felt that the story really, in comparison to Gone Home, which I know that we will just be referring to again and again and again here, felt really, really flat. We've said time and time again, or I certainly have said time and time again, that these type of games are their story. The game only exists to tell you the story that is contained within the game. The amount of gameplay in the game is extremely minimal, and therefore if that story isn't really pretty top notch, then the game has nothing else to fall back on. And a lot of it, to me, the story that they told just felt really, really flat. But honestly, I actually think that the world building in this game was absolutely excellent. It was really, really good. They built a very interesting dystopian world, although maybe that dystopia is not quite as far from reality as we'd like to think there is. But I've a really dystopian world of like hypercapitalism and corporations own everything. I really think that a lot of things that you find on the spaceship as you progress through the game really build the world really, really well, but don't necessarily build the characters very well and don't necessarily pay off in the main story. For example, there's one character who's basically desperately trying to save up for his son to get into a good university, but that doesn't really play out or doesn't have any real consequences in the main story, other than he was a bit hesitant to go into cryosleep to save oxygen for the rest of them, basically, along with two of the other characters. But then again, that was also resolved like almost immediately. You know what I mean? There was no tension in that decision. And I think that a lot of the things that you picked up and you looked at and the objects that you saw and Gone Home and the documents that you read or the books that you read or the scraps of paper that were written down by one of the characters or whatever really spoke about the characters and really paid off in the overall story of the game. Whereas I think that a lot of the things that you pick up in this game and you read and environmental storytelling that's going on really goes to build the world. And it's such an interesting world that they've built. Like, I genuinely like it. Like, this is in-space sci-fi dystopian future. Like, AIs, they've got a whole subsection about AI rights, which is a genuinely interesting topic and is way more interesting than it sounds. And all of this is like massively up my street. And I really just think that the story that they told in this amazing world that they built was actually not that interesting at all, really. It's just sort of like big corporation is bad. So basically the story plays out is that all the characters on Tacoma think that they have been hit by an asteroid which has caused their oxygen supply to become very limited. They then decide that 3 of the 6 main characters have to go into cryosleep, which they can only be in for a very limited amount of time before they effectively become brain dead. That happens, then 3 remaining characters then try and build themselves a pod, basically, to get off the ship, which goes wrong and ends up with 2 of them getting hurt. The AI then comes to the rescue a little bit and doesn't quite directly tell one of the characters, who is basically the AI's pal, where to go to save themselves, effectively. And then you find out that the Tacoma wasn't hit by an asteroid. It was all pre-planned that these people would die up in space, and it was all to do with passing legislation that effectively allowed AI-only manning of spaceships, which effectively would do away with a whole bunch of jobs. And there's a whole union part of this as well. And a lot of this world around about the story that's actually happening, I find like really fascinating. Yeah. All of that is really fascinating, apart from the bit that you had to watch vignettes for, which I really found wasn't very interesting, in all honesty.
Yeah, it was really hit and miss in how interesting a lot of the, as you say, the scenes that we actually interact with, how interesting they were. And also, by extension, the kind of character background stuff that you could also find. So there was often a little kind of hidden room that you could find that would go even further back in time to just show you a little bit of that character's lives. And those things, they were all nice. And the main vignettes, the main plot vignettes, I thought they were fine, but I just thought it was so kind of rushed. As you kind of mentioned there was like one scene, it was like, this is a problem, what are we going to do? Literally like several minutes of gameplay later, it's like, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we're halfway through the plan now. And it just felt like if there had been more room to breathe in this game, and more, whether that just means putting in more vignettes, more locations, or telling more of the story through environmental cues, the way that Gone Home did, that this one lacks a little bit, might have just allowed some of that stuff for the tension to ramp up. I was basically always waiting for whatever actually was happening, and the idea that there's a sort of malfunctioning AI on a spaceship is just quite tropey. And as much as it didn't turn out quite the way I expected it to in that sense, you know, the obvious thing being that Odin was going to be evil like Hal isn't really what transpires. And I think you're kind of
Odin turns out to be the saviour.
Exactly,
right?
It turns out to be the saviour, yeah. And so like it has little things like that, but yeah, just overall it felt to me like, you know, what Gone Home did was it told the characters' stories, the family story, but also it gave you this rich texture. I mean, I remember getting excited about it as we were talking about it at the time. This rich texture of like the father's career is in kind of tatters, and he's got this problem with his dad historically, and the mother's thinking about having an affair, and it's all connected
but all of that reflects in the main story as well, and none of that came through in Tacoma. Like you had pieces of information like that in Tacoma as well, but none of it was really reflected in the main story that you were watching. Another thing that I would say as well is that in Gone Home, it always felt like exploration. You were exploring this home for the first time. Yeah. You were going through rooms that were unfamiliar to you and unfamiliar to the character. And although there were sections of the game that were gated off, it always felt like you discovered the next path. Whereas in Tacoma, you were told to go to one area, you completed that area, you were told to go to the next area, you completed that area, you were told to go to the next area, and so on until you finished the game, and that was that. Yeah. You know what I mean? You were always told the next step. There was no feeling of exploration or determining what was happening yourself. You were just going through the motions of what you were being told to do. Yeah. Another thing as well that Gone Home had in spades and Tacoma lacks completely was a feeling of atmosphere of some description. Like, I thought that the atmosphere generated in Gone Home through its music and whatever was great and like weirdly tense. Like I always felt as though I could open up a door and something would jump out on me, despite the fact that I knew that I was the only character in that game. Whereas Tacoma felt very sterile, and I know that that is reflective of a tin box out in space. Like I completely understand that. But in terms of what that meant for the actual playing of the game and traversing that space station, it felt dull. Mm-hmm. I don't really know how else to describe it apart from that. It didn't feel exciting in any capacity, whereas it really did in Gone Home. Like, they really nailed that in Gone Home.
Absolutely. I mean, the house in Gone Home was a character in and of itself, and yet it felt like a haunted house in a lot of ways. You were supposed to explore it with that trepidation of what is going to be behind this door, or why can I hear a TV crackling in that room when there's not supposed to be anyone here. But Tacoma, you're completely right. Like, the areas are siloed, so you're kind of locked into a specific area for a bit of time, and there's just nothing ever really, like, there is no suggestion that the AI is at some point going to attack you as the player character, and there's nothing. I mean, even if we discovered all their dead bodies in the cryopods or something, it wouldn't have really registered as anything other than a tragic space accident, you know? And on that, as you were saying before about just it telling you specifically what to do every time, even the final piece of the puzzle when Odin tells Sarah, the medic, to go through this specific door that they're not supposed to go behind, mind and kind of find what in reality is going on. I hadn't entered that part of the ship yet, the kind of...
No, I don't think you were supposed to.
No,
I hadn't entered it yet.
Because when you get to that... maybe I just didn't even try the door, maybe that was locked or whatever, but you come to that final section and there's two ways to go. There's the engineering bit and then there's the kind of systems bit, for want of a better phrase. And I went down at the engineering bit first, where you see the pod explode and all that stuff, and that's when Odin tells Sarah, actually do this. And Natalie even says to Sarah at that point, oh, you have to go through this kind of network tunnel between these two areas, which I did. But you don't have to do that at all. And it hadn't even allowed me to kind of get to that final section and see that door and wonder what was going on. It just told me to go there. And then I went there and found out the truth, you know, and that just felt like a misstep as well.
I completely agree with that. And the ending did fall very flat because basically you discover, as I said, that this evil corporation was doing this. The characters all managed to get a distress signal out and then they all get rescued, basically. I certainly felt very little investment in any of the characters or their well-being at that moment. And it's sort of revealed as well that you are secretly there to steal Odin's wetware, quotes, which is actually like its brain, I suppose.
Effectively,
and that you're sort of there to save Odin, the AI. However, Lewis, what I think would be a significantly better ending to this game, if at the moment where the pod that they're trying to make blows up, that they then fail at that point and they do die and they are the victims of this horrible corporate plan and to basically build bungalows, it seems to be. But the evil corporation facilitates their death and they fail in that moment, and then you come on to the spaceship and then the entire thing plays out exactly as it did, and then in that moment either Odin leaves something for you, like opens the door for you before he goes away into hibernation and whatever, and then you go into the systems room, not Sarah, and you're not told about what has happened through the lens of Sarah. You discover that for yourself, what actually happened to these people, not them discovering it. I think that that would be a significantly better ending, and I think that the ending would have landed so much better if everyone had died, which I know is very bleak to say, but if everyone had died and the whole thing had played out exactly the same way, but Odin, knowing that someone would eventually come, left this secret door open for you, and you walk in there and you discover what has actually happened to these people, and they die in ignorance thinking that they've been hit by an asteroid, when in actual fact they have been murdered by a mega corporation. I think that would have been a much better ending.
I think you're totally right. That's such a much more interesting telling of what's happening here. Absolutely. It just feels like there's several missteps in the telling of this story and the characterization. You know, it was ambitious to follow up Gone Home with a sci-fi set thing and to try and push those mechanics in different directions, but it feels like in doing so they lost a bit of contact with what really is at the heart of their game, which is a human story that just didn't really feel like that by the end.
Absolutely. And I have to say that I don't actually think that this is a bad game, and I don't think either of us are saying that it's a bad game. And it does have genuinely interesting world, genuinely interesting commentary, social commentary on capitalism and mega corporations. But in reality, the story that they told in that world and the story that you experienced playing the game did fall short. And for that, and particularly for the price that this game goes for now that it's not on Games Pass anymore, I would find it quite difficult to recommend this, honestly.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, it would be great bundled with Gone Home, but otherwise maybe don't bother.
Well, Lewis, on that slightly sad note, I'd like to remind everyone that you can find PlayersToo on all the social media. That's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, the lot. You can also find our written content over at PlayersToo.com. That's PlayerStoo.com. And if you could take 5 seconds to give us 5 stars over on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, it really, 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 really helps us out. I know I say it twice a week, every week, but it does not become less important on a weekly basis. If you could do that for us, it would genuinely help us out so much, and we are so grateful to anyone that's already done that for us. You are an absolute legend to us. Well, Lewis, it is now time for us to announce our new play-along game for November, and that is Lucas Pope's Papers, Please, which I have not played yet, but I know that you have, and it's something that I've been meaning to get around to for a long time. So this is finally going to force me to actually play it, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I first played this game maybe 5 years ago or more, and it's an interesting thing. It's a strange game in a lot of ways, but I'm really keen to know what you think of it and what other people who are going to give it a bash think of it. Just to say on that, thanks so much to anyone who told us what they thought about Tacoma Tacoma on social media. It's really appreciated. Definitely, if you're going to play Papers, Please, or if you've already played it, let us know your thoughts on the game as well. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, definitely. I love getting those conversations going on social media, 100%. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will see you next week.
Thanks.